They mocked the mail-order bride's Gullah accent, until the black cowboy welcomed her in her own tongue. The dust didn't care who you were. It got in your mouth, in your eyes, settled in the folds of your clothes like a second skin, a gritty shroud for the living, and she was barely living. She stood on the splintered platform of the train station, a place that was less a station and more a suggestion of one, just a raised plank of wood baking in the relentless sun. The heat came up from the ground in waves, distorting the air, making the small, mean-looking collection of buildings shimmer and dance. She held a single bag, a pathetic thing made of rough-spun cloth, and in her other hand, she clutched a letter. The paper was worn soft, folded and unfolded so many times the creases were about to give way. It was a liar, that letter. It spoke of a new start, of a respectable life, of a husband who owned a small mercantile. It said nothing of the silence that would greet her, a silence thicker and more hostile than any she had ever known. And then, the silence broke. A man, stout and red-faced with a vest that couldn't quite contain his belly, pointed a thick finger at her. He'd been watching her from the porch of the saloon across the dusty track that served as a main street. He said something to his companions, and a low chuckle rumbled through them. She didn't catch the words, not exactly, but the tone was universal. It was the sound of contempt. She shifted her weight, the worn leather of her shoes scraping against the wood. The man who was supposed to meet her, the man whose name was on the letter, was nowhere to be seen. Just a few hard-faced men and a couple of women who peered at her from behind curtained windows, their faces pinched with suspicion. One of the men, younger and bolder than the rest, sauntered closer. "You the one? The mail order thing for old Peterson?" he asked, a smirk playing on his lips. She swallowed, the dust in her throat turning to mud. She nodded, just a small, jerky movement. "He ain't here," the man said, stating the obvious. "Took sick, real sick." The lie was as plain as the dirt on his face. She knew it. He knew she knew it. It was a game, a cruel one. I can wait," she said, and the sound of her own voice, thick with the coastal cadence of her people, felt alien and loud in the dry air. It was the sound of the sea, of wet air and salt marshes, of a language shaped by water and isolation. Here, under the hammer of the sun, it sounded wrong. The man's smirk widened into a grin. He turned to his friends. "You hear that? What kind of talk is that?" Laughter erupted. Not a friendly chuckle, but sharp barking sounds that felt like stones being thrown. "Sounds like she got a mouthful of mud," one of them yelled. "Hey girl, you speak American?" another one called out. Her face, which had been a mask of weary endurance, began to crumble. Her shoulders slumped. The hand holding the letter trembled. She had traveled for weeks, crammed into dusty train cars, living on stale bread and the dregs of hope. She had endured the stairs, the cramped spaces, the rocking motion that never seemed to leave her body. She'd held on to the promise of this place, this new life, like a drowning woman holding onto a piece of driftwood. And now, the driftwood was turning out to be a snake. The pain of it was a physical thing, a sharp ache behind her ribs. The mockery wasn't just about her words. It was about her, all of her. It was a judgment on where she came from, on the color of her skin, on the very fact of her existence in their world. She stared down at the dusty planks, at the cracks in the wood, wishing she could fall through them, back into the earth, back to a place where the air didn't cut and the words didn't sting. The silence that followed the laughter was worse. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket. She was an island, and the sea around her was made of hate. Her journey hadn't ended here on this platform. It had just delivered her to a new kind of hell, one without walls or bars, but just as inescapable. Her eyes burned, but she refused to let the tears fall. That was a small victory, the only one she had left. She would not give them her tears. She just stood there, a solitary figure in a borrowed dress, with the dust settling on her shoulders like a final, damning verdict. The world had gone quiet, and in that quiet she could feel her last bit of hope shriveling up and dying. Hey folks, if you're finding this story compelling, let me know where in the world you're watching from down in the comments section below. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. And if you haven't already, please consider hitting that subscribe button and turning on notifications. It really helps the channel grow and ensures you don't miss what happens next. I appreciate all of you. Now, let's get back to it. He saw it all from the far end of the street, where the heat and the smell of the forge hung in the air. His name was Silas, though not many in this town used it. To them, he was just the cowboy, the one who kept to himself out on the edge of the scrubland, the one who handled horses better than he handled people. He was hammering a hot piece of iron on his anvil, the rhythmic clang a part of the town's daily noise, but his rhythm had faltered. He'd stopped, hammer held mid-air, when he saw the woman on the platform. He'd known what she was the moment he saw her. Another hopeful soul lured west by a lying piece of paper. He'd seen it before. It rarely ended well. Silas was a man carved from the land itself. All hard lines and quiet endurance. He wasn't looking for trouble. In fact, he spent most of his days avoiding it, content with the company of his horse and the vast, unforgiving sky. His world was one of routine, of mending what was broken, be it a fence line or a horse's shoe. He had a code, a simple one: mind your own business. But the sound of that laughter, sharp and ugly, traveled on the hot wind and found him. It grated on him, scraped against something deep inside. He watched the men, puffed up and cruel, circling her like coyotes. He saw the way her shoulders fell, the way she seemed to shrink into herself, trying to disappear. He felt a familiar, unwelcome churn in his gut. It was the same feeling he got when he saw a man whip a horse for no reason. A senseless cruelty that served no purpose but to make the abuser feel big. He set the hammer down. The clang it made was final. He wiped his hands on a greasy rag, his movements deliberate, slow. He wasn't a man given to impulse. Every action was weighed. He walked out from under the shade of his lean-to, into the full glare of the sun. He didn't stride, he didn't swagger. He just walked, his boots scuffing up little puffs of dust. He was tall, and the years of hard work had stripped him of any softness, leaving whipcord muscle and bone. He wore no gun, not in town, but his presence was its own kind of weapon. The men on the platform saw him coming. Their laughter died in their throats. They shifted, suddenly less sure of themselves. Silas didn't look at them. His eyes were fixed on the woman. He saw the exhaustion etched around her eyes, the tremor in her hand. He saw the resilience there too, the stubborn refusal to cry. He walked right past the men, so close his shoulder almost brushed the ringleaders, and stopped in front of her. He didn't say a word. He just stood there for a moment, a bulwark between her and the town. Then he unhooked the canteen from his belt. He uncorked it and held it out to her. It was a simple gesture, but in that place, at that moment, it was everything. It was an acknowledgement, an offer of aid, a line drawn in the dust. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. She saw a man whose face was a mask of sun-baked leather, his eyes deep-set and hard to read. There was no pity in his gaze, but there was no contempt either. There was just stillness. She hesitated, then slowly, her hand shaking, she reached out and took the canteen. Her fingers brushed against his, and it felt like a jolt of lightning in the dry air. He gave a curt nod, his gaze flicking to her single, sad-looking bag. "Come on," he said. His voice was rough, like stones grinding together, unused to conversation. It wasn't a question. It was a command, but not an unkind one. It was the voice of a man who had made a decision and expected to be obeyed. Without a backward glance at the silent, gaping men, he turned and started walking back the way he came. He didn't check to see if she was following. He just knew she would. She had no other choice. His cabin was more of a dugout, really, built into the side of a low rise, shielded from the worst of the wind. It was small, just one room, but it was clean and orderly. A cot in one corner, a rough-hewn table with 2 stools, a stone fireplace and shelves holding a few tins of food, some books, and neatly folded blankets. It was a place of solitude, and her presence in it felt like a disruption, like a stone dropped into a still pond. He didn't say anything as he entered. He just went to the fireplace, stirred the embers from the morning's fire, and added a few pieces of mesquite. He moved with an economy of motion, every action having a clear purpose. He gestured for her to set her bag down by the door, then pointed to one of the stools at the table. She sat, her back ramrod straight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She watched him, wary, like a rabbit watching a hawk. He took a pot from a hook, filled it with water from a barrel in the corner, and set it on the fire to heat. Then he opened a can of beans and dumped them into a smaller pan. The silence was thick, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the scrape of the metal spoon against the pan. It wasn't the hostile silence of the town. It was a neutral quiet, a silence of work and routine. He wasn't ignoring her. He was just doing what needed to be done. He put the pan of beans near the fire to warm and then turned to her. He looked at her hands, still clutching each other in her lap. One of them was scraped raw, probably from the rough journey or a fall she'd taken. He walked over to a shelf, took down a small wooden box and brought it to the table. He opened it. Inside was a clean rag, a small jar of dark, strong-smelling salve, and a roll of bandage. He didn't ask her permission. He just pulled the other stool over, sat down in front of her, and gently took her hand. She flinched, pulling back instinctively. He stopped, his large, calloused hand hovering in the air. He didn't try again. He just waited. His patience was a solid, physical thing. After a long moment, she slowly, hesitantly extended her hand again. He took it, his touch surprisingly gentle. He poured a little water from the kettle onto the rag and carefully cleaned the dirt and dried blood from the scrape. She winced, but didn't pull away. Then he dipped his fingers into the salve and rubbed it over the wound. The stuff smelled of pine and something else, something earthy and medicinal. It stung for a second. Then a cool numbness spread through her skin. He wrapped the bandage around her hand, his movements deft and practiced. When he was done, he let go of her hand and pushed the stool back. The whole time, he hadn't said a word. He served the beans onto 2 tin plates, along with a thick slice of bread for each of them. He set one plate in front of her. "Eat," he said. It was the first word he'd spoken since they'd arrived. She looked at the food. It was the plainest meal she could imagine, but it felt like a feast. She picked up the spoon and took a tentative bite. The beans were warm and salty, and she was suddenly, ravenously hungry. They ate in silence, the rhythm of their spoons against the tin plates the only conversation. It was a ritual of survival. Food, water, mending a wound. These were the first words in a language she was beginning to understand. A language of action, not sentiment. It was a language of safety. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she felt the tight knot of fear in her stomach begin to loosen, just a little. They sat by the fire after they had cleared the plates. The sun had set, and the world outside the cabin was a deep, star-dusted black. The fire cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. The quiet returned, but it was different now. It was a shared quiet. Silas stared into the flames, his face grim. After a long time, he spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "Out there," he said, nodding his head toward the dark window. "2 graves." She followed his gaze, though there was nothing to see but their own reflections in the glass. "My wife, Sarah. My boy, Samuel." He didn't look at her. He just kept staring into the fire as if the story was written in the embers. Fever took 'em, both in a week. Town doctor wouldn't come out this far. Said it wasn't worth the trip. He paused, and the silence was filled with the weight of that simple, brutal statement. "I dug the holes myself, said the words myself. Been just me and the horses since." He didn't say it with self-pity. He said it like a fact, like stating the weather. It was a blunt, unadorned piece of his history, offered up without ceremony. He was showing her his wounds, the ghosts that haunted this small patch of earth. He had built his life around their absence. It explained the solitude, the gruff exterior, the reluctance to engage with a world that had taken everything from him. He fell silent again, the confession hanging in the air between them. Now it was her turn. The safety he had offered her, the food, the tending of her wound, his own raw confession, it all worked to loosen something inside her. The words started to come, hesitant at first, then flowing in a rush, her Gullah accent thick and undisguised. "Back home," she began, her voice soft. "We live by Dawada. Everything smell of salt and plow mud. My people, we come from a long way away. We carry the old stories." She told him about the rice fields, the back-breaking work under a sun just as hot as the one here, but wet, humid. She spoke of her family, of a mother who knew herbs and a father who could read the tides. "They sell the land," she said, her voice catching. A man in a fine suit, he come wid papers. Say de land ain't ours no more. Never was, he say. My daddy, he fight. Not wid fists, wid words. They ain't listen to his words. She recounted the story, not in a neat, orderly narrative, but in a series of vivid, painful snapshots. The loss of their home. The family scattered. The desperation that led her to answer a letter from a man she'd never met. A man in a place called Texas who promised a new life. They tell me go west, nothing for you here no mo. So I come. I think it be different. Her voice trailed off. She didn't need to explain the rest. He had seen the rest on that dusty platform. Her story was different from his, but the core of it was the same. Loss, displacement, a world that had turned its back on them. His was a story of fever and indifference. Hers was one of greed and injustice. But both ended here, in this small, quiet room. Two people sharing the ghosts of their past. He didn't offer words of comfort. He just nodded, a slow, understanding movement of his head. He had heard her. And in this place, being heard was a miracle. The quiet didn't last. Few days later, the threat wasn't a memory or a ghost, but something real and loud, riding toward them on horseback. Silas was out by the small corral checking the hoof of his mare when he heard them. The sound of hoofbeats, too many for a lone rider, and the boisterous, ugly sound of drunken laughter. He straightened up, his whole body going still and alert. Trouble. He'd known it was coming. He glanced toward the cabin, where she was hanging some washed clothes on a line he'd strung up. Her back was to the riders. Inside, he said, his voice low but carrying. Now. She didn't question. She saw the look on his face. She dropped the wet cloth and scurried into the cabin, closing the door behind her. Silas walked to the front of the cabin, positioning himself between the door and the approaching men. There were 3 of them. The ringleader from the station, his face flushed with cheap whiskey, and 2 of his friends. They reined in their horses a few yards away, kicking up a cloud of dust. "Evening, Cowboy," the man slurred, a malicious grin on his face. "Just came for a neighborly visit. Wanted to see how your guest is settling in." "She's fine," Silas said, his voice flat. "And you ain't neighbors. State your business or ride on." The man laughed. "Business? We heard you got yourself some strange company. Some kind of woman who can't even talk right. We figured you might be lonely out here. Thought we'd come keep you both company." His friends snickered, their eyes darting toward the cabin door. They were predators, smelling weakness. Silas didn't move. His hands were loose at his sides. He was like a rock in the middle of a stream, unmoving, forcing the current to go around him. "This is my land," he said. "You're trespassing." "Your land?" The man spat on the ground. "This is free country. We go where we please. Now, you gonna show us some hospitality, or do we have to invite ourselves in?" He made a move to dismount. That was the moment. The air crackled. Fast. He moved so fast. Silas took 2 quick steps forward. He didn't reach for a weapon. He grabbed the bridle of the man's horse, a hard, vicious yank. The horse shrieked, rearing up in surprise and pain. The drunk rider, caught off balance, tumbled backward out of the saddle, landing in the dirt with a heavy thud. A cloud of dust. Curses. The other 2 men froze, their hands hovering near their hips. They hadn't expected that. They'd expected a standoff. Words. Not this sudden, brutal efficiency. Before they could react, Silas had a heavy blacksmith's hammer in his hand. He hadn't run to get it. It had been resting on a stump nearby. It seemed to just appear in his grip. He didn't raise it. He just held it. A promise of violence. "Get off my land," he said, each word a chip of ice. The man on the ground scrambled to his feet, his face a mask of fury and humiliation. He looked at Silas, at the hammer, at his friends who were suddenly looking a lot less brave. He hesitated, then turned and grabbed the reins of his horse. No more words. They wheeled their horses around, a final hateful glare. Then they kicked their mounts into a gallop, disappearing back the way they came. Dust settled. The hammer was lowered. Silas stood there, breathing heavily, the adrenaline still pumping. The cabin door creaked open. She stood there, her face pale, a cast-iron skillet held in her hands like a weapon. She had been ready to fight with him. He looked at her, then at the skillet, and a small, almost imperceptible twitch pulled at the corner of his mouth. He nodded. She nodded back. A raw, survivalist unity. They had faced the first threat together. The days that followed the confrontation settled into a new rhythm, one built on a foundation of shared struggle. The space between them, once filled with wary silence, now held a quiet, unspoken understanding. It wasn't about words. It was about the small, unconscious gestures of two people learning to inhabit the same small corner of the world. He would be out mending a fence line under the brutal sun, and she would appear at his side with a tin cup of cool water from the barrel, her presence a silent offering. She wouldn't say anything, just hold it out. He would take it, drink it down, and hand it back with a curt nod. The nod meant thank you, it meant I see you, it meant this helps. She took an interest in the small garden he kept, a patch of struggling vegetables behind the cabin. She had a way with the soil, a knowledge that seemed to be in her bones. She'd spend hours there, her hands in the dirt, coaxing life from the dry ground. One afternoon, he found her staring at a patch of stubborn, rocky earth. He came back from his workshop with a pickaxe and, without a word, began to break up the hard-packed soil, turning it over until it was soft and ready for planting. He was the brute strength, she was the patient knowledge. Together, they made the garden grow. The biggest test came with the storm. The sky turned a sickening shade of yellow-green, and the wind began to howl, a low moan that grew into a scream. A dust storm, a bad one, was bearing down on them. "The horses!" Silas yelled over the wind. They ran to the corral. The animals were panicked, their eyes wide with terror, bucking against the rails. He fought to get a rope on the mare, but she was wild with fear, rearing and striking. A hoof caught him in the shoulder, sending him staggering back. He hit the ground, the wind knocked out of him. For a second, he just lay there, gasping for air. The woman, he was still just thinking of her as the woman, didn't scream or run for cover. She darted forward, grabbing the trailing rope. She didn't pull against the horse's strength. Instead, she began to speak to it, her voice a low, melodic chant in her gullah tongue. The words were strange, but the tone was calming, a rhythmic song against the chaos of the wind. The panicked mare stopped fighting. Her ears twitched. She listened. The woman kept chanting, her voice steady. And slowly, gently, she led the terrified animal toward the relative safety of the lean-to. Silas pushed himself to his feet, his shoulder throbbing. He watched her, a small figure against the swirling brown apocalypse, calming a 1,000-pound animal with the sound of her voice. She was not fragile. She was not a victim. She was a force of nature in her own right, as powerful as the storm they were fighting. They worked together then, herding the other horse, securing the doors and windows of the cabin, battling the wind and the choking dust. They moved as a single unit, anticipating each other's needs. A grunt or a pointed finger, all the communication they needed. They were two stones, standing against the wind, side by side. When the storm finally passed, leaving a world coated in a fine layer of red dust, they stood in the doorway of the cabin, exhausted and filthy. He looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw the strength that had been there all along, the fire he was only just beginning to recognize. The bond between them had been forged in survival, but now it was being tempered into something else, something deeper and more resilient than either of them could have predicted. A week later, their supplies were running low. The trip to town was unavoidable. Silas knew it would mean trouble, but starvation was a more immediate threat than gossip. They rode in on the wagon, the woman sitting beside him on the hard plank seat. She wore one of his old clean shirts, which was too big for her but offered more protection from the sun and stares than her worn-out dress. As they pulled onto the main street, a hush fell over the town. Windows that had been empty now had faces in them. People stopped what they were doing to watch them pass. It was a hostile, palpable silence, the kind that precedes a verdict. At the general store, the air was thick with it. The storekeeper, a balding man named Henderson, barely met Silas's eyes. He grunted in response to their order for flour, salt, and coffee. Two women who had been browsing at a fabric table stopped their chatter. They turned, their faces masks of open disapproval, and began whispering to each other, their voices just loud enough to carry. "Shameless," one of them said, not bothering to hide her contempt. "Bringing her into a decent place. Heard she put some kind of spell on him," the other one added, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and relish. That's why he acts so strange. It's that jungle talk she does. The woman next to Silas flinched as if struck. She shrank in on herself, her shoulders hunching, trying to make herself smaller. All the strength she had shown in the garden during the storm seemed to evaporate under the heat of their judgment. Silas saw it. He saw the light dim in her eyes. He finished loading their supplies into a crate, his movements deliberate. He paid Henderson, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He could have ignored them. He could have walked out. That was his way. Avoid, endure, retreat to his solitude. But something was different now. The solitude wasn't just his anymore. Their whispers weren't just about her. They were an attack on his home, on the fragile peace they had built. He picked up the heavy crate of supplies. As he turned to leave, he walked directly toward the two whispering women, forcing them to step aside. He didn't say a word to them. He didn't even look at them. He just kept his eyes on the woman who was waiting by the door. "Let's go," he said. His voice quiet but firm, meant only for her. His action was a shutdown. It was a silent, powerful rebuke. He hadn't lowered himself to their level by arguing. He had simply rendered them, and their opinions, irrelevant. He had made it clear that she was with him, and his protection was a wall they could not breach with their petty cruelty. As they walked out of the store and into the blinding sunlight, he didn't get straight onto the wagon. He stopped and checked the harness on one of the horses, a small, unnecessary adjustment. It was a moment of grace, a chance for her to compose herself, to breathe in air that wasn't thick with poison. He was learning a new language, not of words, but of quiet consideration. The tension followed them from the store. It clung to the air like the dust. As Silas was loading the last of the supplies onto the wagon, the ringleader from the other day, whose name was Jeb, emerged from the saloon. He wasn't drunk this time. He was cold sober, which made him more dangerous. He had his two friends with him, and they blocked Silas's path to the wagon seat, where the woman was already sitting, her hands clenched in her lap. "Silas," Jeb said, his voice low and menacing. "We need to talk." Silas didn't answer. He just stood there, his hand resting on the side of the wagon, his body a shield between Jeb and the woman. "This ain't right," Jeb continued, gesturing with his chin toward her. "You bringing this thing into our town. Decent folks are worried. It ain't natural. What's not natural is a grown man concerning himself with another man's household," Silas said, his voice dangerously calm. "This is my business, not yours. It became my business when you brought her here." Jeb spat, taking a step closer. His friends fanned out, a classic intimidation tactic. The street had gone quiet. Everyone was watching. This was more than a disagreement now. It was a public challenge. Jeb's eyes flicked to the woman. "Why don't you tell her to get out? Send her back where she came from. We don't want her kind here." He took another step, reaching a hand out as if to grab the woman's arm, to pull her from the wagon. He had crossed the line. Something inside Silas, a tightly coiled spring of restraint he'd spent years winding, finally snapped. He didn't shout. He didn't posture. He moved. It was a blur of motion. One moment he was standing by the wagon. The next, his hand had shot out and clamped around Jeb's wrist. His grip was like iron. Jeb cried out in pain and surprise. "You made a mistake," Silas said, his voice a low growl. He didn't just let go. He twisted. There was a sickening crack, the sound of bone giving way. Jeb screamed, a high, thin sound of pure agony, and stumbled back, clutching his broken wrist. The two friends stared, their jaws slack. The bully was broken. The threat was over. Silas stood over him, breathing hard, his chest heaving. His vow of non-involvement, the code that had kept him safe in his isolation for years, lay shattered on the ground along with Jeb's pride. He had drawn a line in the dust before. Now, he had defended it with violence. He turned his back on the whimpering man and climbed onto the wagon seat. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at Jeb's friends, who were now cautiously helping their leader. He looked only at the woman beside him. Her eyes were wide, not with fear, but with something else. Awe, gratitude, understanding. He had not just defended her, he had claimed her publicly as one of his own. He picked up the reins and with a sharp flick set the horses in motion, leaving the town and its judgment behind them in a cloud of dust. The ride back to the cabin was silent. But it was a silence charged with the aftermath of the confrontation. The air crackled with unspoken things. When they arrived, he unhitched the horses and she began to unload the supplies, their movements practiced and synchronized, a familiar routine in a world that had just been irrevocably altered. That evening, they sat not by the fire, but at the small table, a single candle burning between them. The violence in town had stripped away the last layers of pretense. There was a new intimacy in the room, a raw vulnerability that demanded to be addressed. He had broken his code for her. He had stepped out of the fortress of his solitude to stand in front of her. She had to know why. She had to give him something in return. She looked at her hands, then up at him, her dark eyes reflecting the flickering candlelight. "In my place," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "A name is a secret thing. A true name. Not the one they give you to call you by like a dog." She took a deep breath. "They call me Sally on the boat paper, but that ain't me. That ain't my soul's name." Silas waited. He didn't prompt her. He just held the space for her, his patience a vessel for her to fill. He knew this was important. The revealing of a name was a sacred act, an offering of the deepest trust. It was the key to a person's soul. "When I was born, my Gulama, she whisper my name in my ear before anyone else can speak. She say it carried the spirit of Dewata and the strength of the oak tree." Her voice was soft, melodic, her Gullah accent a gentle song in the quiet cabin. She say, "You be Amara. It mean grace. It mean a paradise that can't be taken." She finally looked him directly in the eye, and the weight of her history, her pain, and her hope was in that gaze. "My name," she said, her voice clear and steady, "is Amara." The name hung in the air, beautiful and strong. It was a gift. It was the truest story she had. It was her confession, her testament, her act of faith in him. He had seen her as the woman, a problem to be solved, a responsibility he had reluctantly taken on. But Amara was a person, a soul, with a history and a future. He let the name settle in his mind. He felt its weight, its significance. After a long moment, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. He looked at her, and for the first time he truly saw her, not as a collection of wounds and troubles, but as the woman with the name of grace. "Amara," he said. He spoke her name aloud, his rough voice softening around the syllables. It was an acceptance, a recognition. It was the first time anyone in this hard, dusty land had called her by her true name. It was the sound of a lock turning, a door opening. In that moment, she was no longer the mail-order bride, the stray, the strange talking woman. She was Amara, and she was home. The next morning, the air felt different, washed clean by the emotional storm of the previous night. A new beginning felt possible. After their morning meal, Silas did something he hadn't done in years. He went to an old, dusty trunk that sat in the corner, a relic from his life with Sarah. He opened it, the smell of cedar and memory filling the small room. He rummaged inside and pulled out a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. He brought it to the table where Amara was cleaning the last of the breakfast tins. He set it down in front of her. She looked at him, then at the bundle, her expression questioning. He nodded for her to open it. She carefully untied the string and unfolded the cloth. Inside was a small, leather-bound book, his wife Sarah's journal, and beside it a small, sealed packet of seeds. They were okra seeds, tiny and dark, seeds that Sarah had planned to plant before the fever came. Okra, a plant of the South, a plant that Amara would know. It was a piece of his past, an offering for her future. But that wasn't all. He then walked to the door and gestured for her to follow him outside. He led her to the small protected patch of land beside the cabin, the one he had cleared for her with the pickaxe. The morning sun was gentle, and the earth was still dark and damp. "This," he said, his voice quiet, "is yours. This patch." It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't a flowery declaration. It was a simple statement of fact. This piece of land, his land, was now her land. He was giving her a place to put down roots, a place to belong. He handed her the packet of seeds. Her fingers trembled as she took them. She looked from the seeds in her hand to the plot of rich earth, then up at him. There were tears in her eyes now, but these were not the tears of sorrow or humiliation she had refused to shed on the train platform. These were tears of profound, overwhelming gratitude. She knelt down, her knees sinking into the soft soil. She tore open the packet and poured the small, precious seeds into her palm. Then, with a reverence that was almost prayerful, she began to plant them one by one, pushing each seed into the earth with her finger. She was planting a garden. She was planting a future. She was planting her hope in the soil that he had given her, a seed of belonging in the heart of the unforgiving West. Silas stood and watched her, the lone cowboy who had thought his life was over. He watched the woman named Amara plant a seed of grace in his barren world, and for the first time in a very long time, he felt the possibility of growth. If you enjoyed this story, please give it a like and subscribe for more content.